Okay. Oh, that looks like it might be doing something. Let's check my stream here. Let me see. Maybe my microphone's working now. Okay. All right. Turn on my live stream and see if I can hear myself right here. And of course, if you hear me, you can. Oh, there it is. I hear myself actually. Cool. All right. This stream was not published. I never told anybody about this stream or put it on the meetup or anything like that because, well, you know, it's a holiday, and here I am. Well, it's, you know, for some people it's a holiday if they're taking, you know, a 4-day weekend or something like that. But I decided I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit of a chat here. I'll be watching the chat. If anyone wants to just say what's up, say hi, or ask me a question or anything like that. I'm thinking about doing TikTok style things at some point, you know, spare time, things like this, where I just want to open up a chat and see if anyone wants to chat about anything. So I've made this little thing like they do on TikTok. I'm not really a TikToker, so I've only done it a little bit, and I just decided to make something like this. But in looking for the things that I wanted to talk about today, let me close my door. I decided to go to Medium.com, which is a horrible place to go if you want to learn anything, as far as I'm concerned. So I went to Medium.com. I'm like, let's just pick the random first article that I see and just talk about whatever they're saying and see where I agree, see where I disagree, and all that sort of stuff. And one of the first things that they said on there was, and this is actually a good article I found on Medium, not this one, but it was a different one. They quoted this. They said, it's harder to read code than to write it. And I'm like, I know that quote. So then I instead decided to go look up Joel. I'm like, I remember something about that. I looked up Joel Spolsky, and this is a really old article. So I'm like, I'll just read through this and see if this article has aged well, essentially. So things you should never do, part 1. This was Joel Spolsky in response to things that Netscape was doing. And if you don't know, Netscape is a browser, one of the most prolific old browsers ever. I don't think he worked for Netscape. I'm pretty sure he didn't, actually. But this was just him as a software engineer in the year 2K, and talking about, you know, this horrible decision that Netflix has made, you know. So let's just read through some of it and give some thoughts. And I'm watching the chat as best as I can. If you guys want to say anything, agree or disagree, then let me know. Okay, so Netscape 6 is finally going into its first public beta. There was never a version 5. The last major release, version 4. Okay, so this is just some really basic introductory stuff. 3 years is an awfully long time in the internet world. 3 years is a very long time. Granted, it wasn't as bad back then as it is now, but you know, we really need to think about continuous integration and delivery, where when we deliver new features and new things, we're delivering them daily, if not multiple times a day. So yeah, 3 years compared to multiple times a day is definitely a long time. And this sort of also gets into the whole idea of waterfall versus agile, where they're like, let's make this whole plan of this rewrite, which is what we're talking about here. We're talking about a rewrite to their software. Let's make this whole plan and plan it up front and build this whole thing, and then at some point we'll release the whole thing. There was no idea of a minimally viable product. It's let's spend years planning and creating and rewriting and doing this stuff, and in years we will release something, and hopefully that works. So yeah, this is definitely a different age that we're talking about here. So this is before Windows XP. If you don't know, Windows XP came out in 2001, and this was written in 2000. So Netscape sat by helplessly as their market share plummeted, of course. It's a bit of smarmy. I like that word smarmy. I don't think I've ever really seen it or heard it personally, but I've seen it in writing. Of me to criticize them for waiting so long between releases. They didn't do it on purpose now, did they? Of course they did. Okay, well, it says right here, well, yes, they did. They did it by making the single worst strategic mistake ever. Let's rewrite the code from scratch. And that's not It's not unique to them, obviously. Rewriting the code from scratch is something that we've all seen done. I've rewritten code from scratch, maybe not an entire company worth of code, but I've written some code from scratch, and we've all done that. It's not uncommon. Of course, for such a prolific company, it is definitely horrible. So Netscape wasn't the first company to make this mistake. Borland made the same mistake when they bought Arago, I don't even know what that is, and tried to make it into DBase for Windows. Okay, I know what that is. Okay, database stuff. A Doom project that took so long that Microsoft Access ate their lunch. They made it again when rewriting Quattro Pro, and made the same mistake again when rewriting Quattro Pro from scratch. And astonished people with how few features it had, Microsoft almost made the same mistake trying to rewrite Word for Windows from scratch in a Doom project called Pyramid. I don't know about that. But they shut it down. Okay, so pretty smart thing to do. Probably after they saw what a lot of their competitors were doing, and they said, okay, maybe we don't want to follow that same path. Actually, Microsoft programming and Microsoft code has a good reputation for always being backward compatible, always keeping the old stuff, compared to every other programming language where if you update to a new version of the programming language, you can't keep running the old stuff. Microsoft actually has a really good reputation for backward compatibility. So lucky for Microsoft, they had never stopped working on the old code base, so they had something to ship. And that's pretty good too. I think that's actually fairly common from what I've seen, that if you are doing a rewrite, you're also keeping the old code base up to date, which is a huge level of complexity. And I'm not trying to promote do rewrites and also keep your old thing up to date. That's not what I'm promoting. But in places where you're doing rewrites, that is actually a good decision to make. So programmers are in their hearts architects. I think I can agree with that. In your hearts, we all want to build new things. It's very common. And so when we get to something, we want to bulldoze it flat and build something grand, something with our name on it, right? A lot of developers, they get this feeling of, well, when can I publish something that has my name on it, that shows this was me, and I can say I helped with this, or I built this. And it's different whenever you're going in. We're not excited by incremental renovation tinkering. When you say, I helped build Netscape, the Netscape browser, or I helped build Netflix.com. If you go into something and you say, I fixed some bugs in it, that's a lot less powerful feeling than, I went over to this other streaming platform and helped build it from the ground up. Of course, most of us feel that way, I think. There's a subtle reason why programmers always want to throw away the code and start over. The reason is that they think the old code is a mess. Yes. And here's the interesting observation. They're probably wrong. The reason that they think, well, they're not wrong, it is a mess, but what that foundation is based on, I believe he's going to get into. So the reason that they think the old code is a mess is because of a cardinal fundamental law of programming. It's harder to read code than it is to write it. And you might have heard this quote. This is actually a fairly common quote, which is why I went to go look for Joel, because he's the one who made this quote. It's harder to read code than just to write it. If you haven't heard it, it's something you can definitely put in your book as something that, to remember. Not to say that you should do something about it like, okay, let's rewrite code, but maybe we should be writing our code in a way that's easier to read. And when we go into old code, instead of rewriting, perhaps we should be refactoring and making code easier to read. And I think I can get into some more of that later on. So this is why code reuse is so hard. This is why everybody on your team has a different function they like to use for splitting strings into arrays of strings. They write their own function because it's easier and more fun than figuring out how the old function works. Yeah, some of that's true. So as a corollary of this axiom, I'll say this axiom, you can ask almost any programmer today about their code they're working on. It's a big, hairy mess, they will tell you. I'd like nothing better than to throw it out and start all over. I don't hear this as much in the things that I do. So perhaps you guys have heard that a lot in the stuff that you guys are working on, but I don't hear it as much in the things that I work on. That's because I think a lot of these quotes come from the big ball of yarn, or when you're working in a single repo or a monorepo or a monolith, which I'm not going to outright say is a horrible thing, but if you are working in a monolith that's not observing bounded context, and you have, you know, Project A calling Project B, calling Project C, which then of course calls Project A, and they're all working together in a monolith, you're going to get into a big hairy mess. Not to say hairy messes don't exist in microservices, but on that same note, a lot of people who take monoliths and turn them into a distributed monolith and they call it microservices, you're still going to have a big hairy mess. So a lot of times if someone says, oh well, there's no big hairy mess in microservices, they're talking about actual microservices with great bounded contexts. They're not talking about distributed monoliths that people call microservices, which is actually very common. So long story short, I think this is very common for the day and very common for people who are still building monoliths. And I'm not going to outright just say that monoliths are horrible, because sometimes they're good, especially in smaller projects. A small monolith may not be a horrible thing. But yeah, it's a big hairy mess. I think doesn't directly relate to stuff that I've seen in the last 10 years, you know, that I've architected. Well, they say, look at this function. It is 2 pages long. That's a small function for a lot of ones that I've seen in old code. None of this stuff belongs in there. I don't know what half these API calls are for. Ooh, API calls mixed in with functionality. I talk about separating the functional from the imperative shell in other talks. But so before Borland's new spreadsheet for Windows shipped, Philip Kahn, who's the colorful founder of Borland, was quoted a lot in the press bragging about how Quattro Pro would be much better than Microsoft Excel because it was written from scratch. That doesn't make it better. All new source code, as if source code rusted. Yeah, source code doesn't rust. I like this, as if source code rusted. I like that phrase. That's really good. So the idea that new code is better than old is patently absurd. Old code has been used. It has been tested. This is good, but at the same time, I think there's sort of 2 different kinds of code. There's the code that we want, which is, you know, the business is asking us for functionality. They're telling developers, we need this functionality to work. Our goal is to, you know, we want to be able to demo this functionality. We want to be able to ship this functionality. And when people see it, they're not going to know what the implementation is. They don't care. But whatever that part of the code is that makes this stuff work, that's the stuff that we want. The stuff that we need is logging and stuff related to how we're working with the platform or the framework, or other cross-cutting concerns like APM and authentication. So unfortunately, a lot of our code gets bogged down with bogged down is probably the right term, actually. There's the stuff that we need, which is, maybe I could just simplify by saying cross-cutting concerns. But there's the stuff that we want, which is the stuff really that the business wants. So there's the 2 different things, and I don't know which ones he's talking about here being patently absurd. I would say that in the stuff that we want, which is what the business wants, that would be absurd to say that you can write new code that's better than the old code. But in the stuff that we need, the stuff that's related to like the platform, if you have code that's written with multi-platform involved, it was written in the middle of the 90s, and you're working on it and you're constantly updating it, you could definitely write new code with today's frameworks that are platform agnostic and have logging and APM built into them, and like all this stuff where the frameworks and the frameworks that we're using today for software has abstracted out all of that stuff that we need as software engineers. And so if we write the code new today, this is a huge contrast, right? This is stark. This is something from like the 90s. If we're picking up something from the 90s. So if we're picking up stuff today from the 90s, then rewriting it, you're not going to get any better on the business side, but you may be getting a lot better on the on the platform side, on this, all the abstraction, all the stuff that the frameworks handle for us today, garbage collection, for example. The things that are handled today, you're going to be cleaning up that code a lot. So I wouldn't say patently absurd, but there is some sort of gray area. A lot of times, it depends what you're talking about. So lots of bugs have been found. They have been fixed. There's nothing wrong with it. Yes, all this stuff is true. It doesn't acquire bugs just by sitting around on your hard drive. Au contraire, baby. Is software supposed to be like an old Dodge Dart that rusts just sitting in the garage? Is software like a teddy bear that's kind of gross if it's not made out of all new material? Oh man, that's quite an image. So back to that 2-page function. Yes, I know it's just a simple function to display window, but it has grown little hairs. The imagery in this is astounding. And stuff on it, and nobody knows why. Well, I'll tell you why. Those are bug fixes. Yes. Yeah, this is matured code. One of them fixes. Oh, okay. One of them fixes that bug that Nancy had when she tried to install the thing on a computer that didn't have Internet Explorer. Okay, so it had a dependency, and so controlling those dependencies is very important. This is a lot of stuff that DevOps controls these days. Another one fixes that bug that occurs when in low memory. Okay, of course this is not DevOps because this is not delivery to our service. This is deliveries to customers, so this is a little bit different. Another one fixes that bug that occurs in low memory conditions. Yeah, so we're talking about like garbage collection, for example. Another one fixes that bug occurred when the file is on a floppy disk and the user yanks out the disk in the middle. You know, a lot of these things aren't necessarily bugs with the functionality. And of course, if he was really getting into the functionality, he'd have to be explaining what the business rules were and what the business wanted, which would take a long time. These are things, technical things that we understand, I think, when we're looking at this, we as technical people, but I think more so when the bugs are related to things that are business functionality, then that makes a lot more sense. That you're not going to rewrite this code from scratch, and you're going to lose a lot of that benefit if you're talking about business functionality and bug fixes and things that have matured that business functionality. But if it's talking about platform things, then and dependency not dependency injection, cleanup. Yeah, cleanup. When you're talking about cleanup, then you're talking about things that are like on the OS or in the framework. Then those things can be rewritten. They can be a lot cleaner. They can be platform agnostic instead of platform specific, multi-platform. There's a lot of things that you can gain from rewriting things, but not from the business rules. All of these things that he's talking about apply mainly to business rules, I think. So each of these bugs took weeks of real-world usage before they were found. Yes. The programmer might have spent a couple days reproducing the bug in the lab and fixing it. Yep, so even longer. If it's like a lot of bugs, the fix might be one line of code, or it might even be a couple of characters. But a lot of work and time went into those 2 characters. Yes, super beneficial 2 characters. I can point out also that one of the things that I was looking at whenever I was coming here, when I was trying to figure out what to review during this little stream, is that it was something about documentation. It's some sort of a talk about documentation and how documentation can be beneficial, and which I disagree with in most of the ways, and some of the times I do think it's beneficial. But those 2 characters, when some people might put documentation into code, like right above the 2-character change, like this has to be these 2, this method has to be called in order to do blah, 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 or something like that. That is not very beneficial. But when there are a lot of these changes, what should be happening is, well, hopefully test-driven development, but if not, you figure out the problem, you make the change, and then you write tests against it. And the tests that are written against this function that had a 2-character change, the test describes why that 2-character change had to be there, or why that one line of code had to change. That one line of code had to change because otherwise this test will fail. And the test tests what was happening with the bug. So, so yeah, all of that effort could be documented via a test. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, when you throw away code and start from scratch, you're throwing away all that knowledge and those collected bug fixes, years of programming work. But and this is true for back then, but if you were doing really good test-driven development or following agile practices, and you have the proper level of documentation, then if you were to take the tests and move the tests to a brand new, let's say we wanted to do a rewrite. And again, I'm not promoting doing rewrites. I'm just seeing how well this ages or how much I agree or disagree with some of this stuff. If you put all the tests into a project and you say, I'm going to start this project from scratch, if you start from the tests, if the tests are scratch, and you move those tests to another project, then when you're rewriting it, as long as you get all those tests to pass, you're getting all of those collected bug fixes and years of programming work. But you're rewriting it in a different framework, in a different framework. You're writing it in different programming language, or you're rewriting it in whatever. And in programming language doesn't matter if your tests are, let's say, they're integration tests written in, I don't know, Selenium or some other system. But if this is the same language, then of course, if it's like unit test, then you have to write it inside the same language. But you're gaining all that, you're keeping all that benefit to do a rewrite if you have good testing. And that's actually a really good point for brownfield development, and a very common thing for brownfield development is if you are needing to do a rewrite, hopefully on a fairly small system, then one of the first things you're going to do, apart from finding seams or doing some other brownfield development, you're going to make sure that there's a lot of tests. And so if you do find all the tests and you write some extra tests, then you have these tests, you can move them over and you can do a rewrite and still try to get as much of that benefit from the old programmers as possible. Again, I'm not promoting rewrites, but it's just another thing in brownfield development. So I guess that's not brownfield at that point, it's greenfield or rewrite field. So you are throwing away your market leadership, you are giving a gift of 2 or 3 years to your competitors, and believe me, that's a long time in software years. Again, if we're talking about today and we're talking about continuous integration and delivery, hopefully we're not doing some sort of waterfall practice of doing a lot of planning and doing 2 or 3 years of planning and rewriting. This should be a lot less common today. So I'm not thinking that this is aged very well, but there are still a lot of companies out there that are doing waterfall and doing monoliths. Some of the monoliths are necessary. None of the waterfall is necessary. So yeah, this hasn't aged. This was very common in 2000. This is a lot less common today. So you're putting yourself in an extremely dangerous position where you will be shipping an old version of the code for several years, completely unable to make strategic changes or react to new features that the market demands because you don't have shippable code. You're just explaining why we need CI/CD. This is very good. This is like a lot of the people writing these articles. If you reread these articles, you see the reasons why we've come to where we are right now and why we need things like Agile and CI/CD. Actually, this was before the Agile conference. Also, this was about a year before that Agile conference. So yeah, completely unable to make strategic changes. That's also because not only are you rewriting, but everything you do with the new application or with the old application, you have to be doing this in the same place. You have to do this in the old application and the new application whenever you make changes. You have to do those changes in the old application and also probably change tests in the old application and then also make the changes in the new application. It makes things very, very difficult if you're releasing every 3 years instead of every 3 hours. It should be about every 3 hours or at least once a day. So you are wasting an outlandish amount of time, amount of money writing code. Time is money, so I was right the first time. Writing code that already exists. Is there an alternative? The consensus seems to be that the old Netscape code was really bad. Well, it might have been bad. But you know what? It worked pretty darn well on an awful lot of real-world computer systems. When programmers say that their code is a holy mess, they always do, there are 3 kinds of things that are wrong with it. I think there are 3 kinds of things that are wrong with the code or that are wrong with them saying that. Let's see. So first, there are architectural problems. So with the code, I guess. Yeah, 3 types of things wrong with the code. The code is not factored correctly. The networking code is popping up in its own dialog boxes. This should have been handled in UI code. These problems can be solved one at a time by carefully moving code, refactoring, changing interfaces. So instead of rewriting, he's saying you can refactor. You can, and this is possibly breaking the open-close principle, but you can do very small changes, one thing at a time. You can obsolete old things. It's possible to do all these things. They can be done by one programmer, working carefully and checking all the changes at once. I don't like that. They can be done by one programmer, working carefully and checking in his changes all at once so that nobody else is disrupted. This also makes it sound like a mini waterfall, right? This is like one programmer does a whole lot of stuff very slowly, and then and lets other developers constantly be doing things, and then checks in all the changes at once. I think this is also solved by CI/CD. So if you, instead of doing all that at once, instead every meticulous little change that you make, you commit it to master, and then you're not interrupting the other developers. You're making sure that you're constantly integrated with them. You're constantly, your changes work with their changes. So maybe I wonder if I were to talk to Joel today and were to talk to him about continuous integration, if he would feel that some of this stuff hasn't aged exactly well, or how he would feel like he would change this if he would. So even fairly major architectural changes can be done without throwing away the code. I think architectural changes frequently, or almost by definition, shouldn't be throwing away code. So I think this is right. Most architectural changes are either for abstractions or refactoring. And abstractions and refactoring don't throw away code. They just sort of move the code around. The functionality shouldn't change. But then again, if part of your architectural changes are your old frameworks didn't handle garbage collection very well, but your new ones do, then maybe you're going to be throwing away some garbage collection code that's been manually done. That's possible. So on the Juno project, we spent several months researching, re-architecting at one point, just moving things around, cleaning them up, creating base classes that made sense. Yes, like I said, abstracting and refactoring, and creating sharp interfaces between the modules. But we did it carefully with our existing code base, and we didn't introduce new bugs or throw away working code. It's sort of hard when you're a software architect or a software engineer and you're refactoring. It's hard to stay in that place where you're making inconsequential changes. That I just call them inconsequential changes because there's that gray area between refactoring and changing code. So if you are refactoring your code, you need to be really careful that you don't go too far and that you're not making changes that are going to introduce new bugs or throw away code or throw away working code. A second reason programmers think that their code is a mess is that it is inefficient. The rendering code in Netscape was rumored to be slow, but this only affects a small part of the project. So you can optimize that small, slow part of the project. You don't have to rewrite all of Netscape if there's one part of it that's slow. You don't need to rewrite the whole thing. When optimizing for speed, 1% of the work gets you 99% of the bang. Good. So the third thing is that the code may be doggone ugly. One project I worked on actually had a data type called f-string. Another project had started out using the convention of starting member variables, like private fields, with an underscore, but later switched to the more standard m underscore. That means not only is it possibly private, it is a module level private field. So half the function started with just underscore and half with module level private underscore, which looked ugly. Yes, these are what we call coding standards, which are sort of company based. So frankly, this is the kind of thing you solve in 5 minutes with macro and Emacs, not by starting from scratch. Yes. And of course, today you don't even need a macro and Emacs. You just, at least in Visual Studio, you hit Control RR, which is like rename, and it renames it. Oh, that'll just be like throughout one module. You got a 1,000-line module, it renames in that module. Of course, you could do a regex, or you could do an Emacs, or you could do something like that throughout the whole solution. Actually, in Visual Studio, you can set rules that make sure that you're following these, and you can auto-fix them as well. So it's important to remember that when you start from scratch, there's absolutely no reason to believe that you're going to do a better job than you did the first time. And again, I agree with this, mainly if you're talking about starting from scratch, trying to create the business functionality. If you're starting from scratch for the goal of we're going from platform specific or multi-platform to platform agnostic and changing the entire structure because we need to support infrastructure, or we need to help infrastructure support us, or SRE. The DevOps mentality. We need to allow them to support us. And if we're moving into the cloud or moving into systems and hosting and platforms that don't support our old compiled programming languages in order to get the frameworks on there. Not to say that they can't support it, but to say that because of security reasons or whatever policies that your company has, we can't move this thing written in Smalltalk in the 80s onto our new cloud servers in Azure. We need to rewrite this thing. Then if that sort of thing happens, then you will do a better job related to the things on that platform, but not related to the business functionality. So you need to find where that line is, which is a very, very far line. I mean, that line is pretty hard to find because for the most part, you should not be rewriting your code. So first of all, you probably don't even have the same programming team, almost definitely. So you don't have more experience, you just have different experience, not more experience. You're just going to make you're just going to make most of the old mistakes again, unless you do proper brownfield development and do a lot of and get everything covered by tests. And you're going to introduce new problems that weren't in the original version. Absolutely. I mean, especially you're moving to a whole new platform or platform agnostic. There's going to be new problems. So all of this is true. This is all true stuff. The old mantra, build one to throw away. Ooh, haven't heard that in a long time. Is dangerous when applied to large-scale commercial applications. And again, for the 15th time, hopefully none of us are building large-scale commercial applications. Hopefully what we do for our day-to-day job is small bits of functionality that are very well tested in some sort of an agile principled system. And if it happens to be contributing to an enterprise, then yes, you're working within an enterprise application, but you're keeping within a bounded context. If you're staying in your bounded context and you're working on your code, then you shouldn't be building a whole commercial application that's going to be released. It's continuous release, or I should say continuous integration and delivery. Release is separate from delivery. So large-scale commercial applications, hopefully you're not building large-scale commercial applications in one fell swoop. If you are writing code experimentally, you may want to rip up the function you wrote last week when you think of a better algorithm. That seems like tongue-in-cheek. Is that true? So that's fine. You may want to refactor a class to make it easier to use. Of course, you want to refactor after as like the final step of test-driven development. So that's fine too. But throwing away the whole program is a dangerous folly. And if Netscape actually had some adult supervision with software industry experience, this is like a note to every single company who's bringing on teams of we require at least 2 years of experience in software in development. You got these teams, but you don't have any adult supervision with software industry experience. So they might not have shot themselves in the foot. They might not have shot themselves in the foot so badly. All right, we got through an article. It's about a 30-minute chat. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know, you can message me inside of Techlahoma Slack. And yeah, I hope you guys have a good 4th of July.